As the Beatles announced their breakup in 1970, it felt like the final page of a beloved book had turned. But by 1979, while bonfires of disco records blazed in baseball stadiums, Kool Herc was stretching breaks in the South Bronx, planting hip-hop's first seeds. What happened in the music between those moments that still echoes today?
Welcome to Top Spot 40 Music Docuseries, where we bring the stories behind the music to life.
The 70s. Now there was a decade that knew how to wear its heart on its sleeve. It arrived with bell-bottoms swinging and long hair still catching the breeze, but underneath all that color was a current of uncertainty. The dreamy idealism of the 60s had met the hard edges of reality. A war that wouldn't end, cities struggling, oil prices climbing, and a generation wondering what came next. Through it all, the music didn't just play in the background. It became the conversation itself. When the Beatles announced their breakup in 1970, it felt like the final page of a beloved book had turned. Paul sang "Maybe I'm Amazed," George gave us "My Sweet Lord," and John reminded us that love is still the answer even when the band is gone. The airwaves suddenly belonged to new voices, and those voices were more personal, more reflective. James Taylor sat on his porch in Massachusetts and sang "Fire and Rain," turning private pain into something millions of people felt they could share. Carole King, who had spent the 60s writing hits for everyone else, finally stepped into the spotlight with "Tapestry." That album didn't just sell, it lived in people's homes. You'd hear "It's Too Late" drifting from open windows in suburbs and city apartments alike, a gentle acknowledgement that sometimes things simply don't work out, and that's part of life too. But not everyone was looking inward. Some were turning the volume up and pushing outward. Led Zeppelin thundered across arenas, Robert Plant's howl and Jimmy Page's guitar creating a sound so heavy it seemed to bend the air. Over in England, Pink Floyd were building sonic cathedrals. The Dark Side of the Moon arrived in 1973 and refused to leave the charts for the next 14 years. It wasn't background music, it was a meditation on time, money, madness, and loss. You didn't just listen to it. You took the journey with it, often in the dark, often with friends, watching the spinning prism on the record sleeve catch the light from a lava lamp. While rock was reaching for the heavens, soul music was bringing the truth down to street level. Marvin Gaye had spent years charming us with love songs at Motown, but in 1971 he walked into the studio carrying the weight of the world. The result was "What's Going On?", a record that asked the tough questions about war, poverty, and the environment without ever raising its voice above a velvet plea. Stevie Wonder, still in his 20s, was entering his imperial phase. Inner visions, songs in the key of life. These weren't albums, they were worlds. He sang about his own blindness, about the beauty of his daughter's laugh, about the simple joy of a summer day. His harmonica and clavinet became as recognizable as any human voice on the radio. Down in the churches and clubs of Memphis, Philadelphia, and Chicago, the sound of gospel-trained voices kept evolving. Curtis Mayfield preached with a gentle guitar and "People Get Ready," then sharpened his message with "Superfly." Aretha Franklin had already earned her crown in the 60s, but in the 70s she wore it with even more authority, reminding everyone that respect was not optional. And then there was the funk. James Brown, the hardest working man in show business, kept tightening the groove until it snapped. Parliament Funkadelic, led by the outrageous George Clinton, took funk to outer space with motherships, glitter, and bass lines that made your ribcage vibrate. Give Up the Funk wasn't just a song, it was a command. By the middle of the decade, something new was happening in the clubs of New York. The beat got faster, the lights got brighter, and disco was born. At first it was underground, a beautiful mix of Black, Latino, and gay culture finding common ground on the dance floor. Donna Summer's "Love to Love You Baby" stretched out over 17 hypnotic minutes. The Bee Gees, those three brothers from Australia who had once sounded like the Beatles, reinvented themselves with white suits and stratospheric harmonies. Saturday Night Fever turned disco into a global phenomenon. For a while, it felt like the whole country learned to dance. The hustle, the bump, the electric slide. People who had never set foot on a dance floor were suddenly moving under mirrored balls. Of course, every revolution eventually meets resistance. By 1979, the disco sucks backlash had turned ugly, with bonfires of records in baseball stadiums. But while some were burning disco platters, others were quietly inventing the future. In the South Bronx, DJs like Kool Herc were stretching breaks on funk records, talking over the microphone and watching kids dance in ways no one had seen before. Hip-hop was still in its infancy, but the beat was already changing. Not all the decade's music was loud or fast. Some of it was as smooth as a country road at twilight. The Eagles took the California sound and polished it until it gleamed. Take It Easy, Hotel California, Desperado. These songs captured the ache beneath the good times, the sense that paradise might have a price. Jackson Browne, Linda Ronstadt, and Fleetwood Mac brought their own brand of California melancholy mixed with undeniable groove. Rumors became the soundtrack to a million divorces and makeups, its pain wrapped in some of the catchiest melodies ever recorded. Across the Atlantic, Britain was producing its own colorful characters. Elton John sat at his piano in outrageous glasses and turned his pain into sing-alongs. Your Song, Tiny Dancer, Rocket Man, each one a small movie in 3 minutes. David Bowie kept shape-shifting. Ziggy Stardust, the Thin White Duke, always one step ahead of everyone else. He sang about space, about alienation, about falling in love with the wrong person at the right time. And then there was Queen. Freddie Mercury, in his white tank top and mustache, conducted stadiums full of people like they were his personal orchestra during We Will Rock You. They were theatrical, ridiculous, and completely irresistible. Country music was changing too. The clean-cut Nashville sound suddenly felt too tame for a new generation of outlaws. Willie Nelson braided his hair, sang with a hole in his guitar, and sounded like wisdom wrapped in smoke. Waylon Jennings growled his way through songs about mamas who didn't raise their boys to be cowboys. Together, they gave us the soundtrack to a movement that said you could love country music and still be a rebel. As the decade drew toward its close, a new generation was getting restless. In London, the Sex Pistols smashed their way onto television and declared themselves the antidote to everything polite. Johnny Rotten's snarl and God Save the Queen felt dangerous in the best possible way. In New York, the Ramones kept it simple, loud, fast, and fun. Punk was short-lived in its pure form, but its spirit cracked open the door for everything that came after. Looking back now, the 70s feel like a bridge we didn't realize we were crossing at the time. It was the decade when album rock found its maturity, when black music moved from the margins to the center of the culture, when women singer-songwriters told their truths without apology, and when the dance floor became a place of liberation. The music absorbed the shocks of Watergate, the end of Vietnam, the energy crisis, and the first whispers of the digital age. Through it all, the songs kept arriving like old friends. Bridge Over Troubled Water, Imagine, Superstition, Stayin' Alive, Bohemian Rhapsody, Wuthering Heights. The records we played on our turntables and 8-tracks weren't just entertainment, they were companions. They helped us fall in love, helped us survive breakups, helped us drive through the night, helped us believe that even when the world felt like it was falling apart, beauty and rhythm and soul could still be found. And perhaps that's the deepest truth the 70s left us. Change is constant. The world will keep spinning, sometimes too fast, sometimes in directions we never expected. But the music adapts, it bends, it mourns, it celebrates, it dances, it remembers. And somehow it always brings us back to each other. So the next time you hear that familiar guitar intro or that unmistakable bass line float through the air, let it take you back. Let it remind you of where you were, who you loved, and how alive you felt. Because the 70s didn't just give us songs. It gave us a map for navigating change with heart, with courage, and most of all, with groove. And that map still works today.
Thank you for joining us for Top Spot 40 Music Docuseries. Discover all the stories behind the music at topspot40.com. Until next time, keep the music playing.